In a crowded courtroom, Susan, a young black girl, quietly tells the judge that she's hungry. What happens next leaves everyone stunned. As the townspeople look on in shock, one question lingers. Will the judge's unexpected choice lead to healing or create disorder? Judge Richard Donald sat in his chair, looking around the room. His black robe felt heavy, just like the choices he had to make. He'd been listening to case after case, staying calm and speaking clearly each time. "Next case," he said, not waiting long. A young black woman stepped forward. Her shoulders were slumped and her eyes were on the floor. She looked tired and beaten down. Judge Donald watched her closely. "Ella Thomas," the clerk called, "charged with petty theft." Judge Donald nodded. "Proceed." The woman's lawyer, a tall, thin man, started to speak. "Your Honor, my client, Miss Thomas, was found taking expired goods from Joe's grocery on Main Street." "Expired?" Judge Donald asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yes, Your Honor. The items were past their expiration date and were set to be thrown away. Miss Thomas, a single mother, was desperate to feed her daughter." Judge Donald's gaze shifted to Ella. She stayed quiet, her hands held tightly in front of her. Despite her shame, she showed quiet strength. "Miss Thomas," Judge Donald said, his voice softer, "do you have anything to say?" Ella lifted her head, meeting the judge's eyes. "I'm sorry, Your Honor," she said softly. "I didn't know what else to do. My little girl, Susan, she was hungry. I couldn't watch her go without food again." The room fell silent. Judge Donald felt something stir inside him, something he usually pushed aside. He noticed the tears in Ella's eyes and how her lips trembled. "Your Honor," her lawyer spoke again, "Miss Thomas has never been in trouble before. She works hard, but has been through difficult times. Her husband was wrongly imprisoned 2 years ago, leaving her alone to care for their daughter. She's been struggling to survive since then." Judge Donald leaned back, thinking hard. He was known for following the law strictly, but as he looked at Ella, he saw more than just a case number. He saw a mother on the edge, a person the system had failed. For a moment, he forgot where he was. His mind wandered to his own life, where his fridge was always full, and his problems seemed small compared to this woman's. He felt a deep ache, a mix of sympathy and guilt. "Miss Thomas," he said, his tone still kind but firm, "the law is clear on theft. However, your situation is unusual." Judge Donald leaned forward, looking directly at Ella. "Do you understand what you are being charged with?" Ella nodded, her eyes full of tears. "Yes, Your Honor," she whispered. Suddenly, a small voice broke the silence. A little girl, about 7 or 8, sat next to Ella. Her big brown eyes were wide, and her small body looked even smaller on the big wooden bench. "Who are you, young lady?" the judge asked, his tone softer than before. "I'm Susan," the girl said clearly. "That's my mommy." She pointed at Ella, who looked embarrassed. Judge Donald's expression changed as he looked at Susan. "Susan, you're not supposed to speak unless—" "I'm hungry," Susan interrupted, her voice honest and direct. The courtroom went quiet. The truth of her words hit everyone hard. Ella started to cry, trying to hold back tears while reaching out to touch Susan's shoulder. Judge Donald sat back, shocked. In all his years, no one had spoken like this in his courtroom. The little girl's words cut through all the legal talk, revealing the real story behind the case. He looked at Susan more closely. Her clothes were clean but old, and her shoes were worn out. Even though she said she was hungry, there was a spark in her eyes that moved the judge deeply. Then he turned to Ella. He saw her desperation, the way she held Susan close, and the struggles that had shaped her life. This wasn't just about stealing, it was about survival. The room stayed silent, heavy with emotion. The public defender seemed hopeful, sensing a change. The prosecutor shifted nervously. Judge Donald, known for always following the law, now faced a tough decision. He sat there, no longer just a judge, but a person seeing real pain in front of him. The law felt cold and empty when faced with a hungry child and a struggling mother. After thinking for a moment, Judge Donald said, "We'll take a short break," surprising everyone. Without explaining, he stood up and walked out of the courtroom, his robe swaying behind him. As soon as he left, the room filled with quiet whispers. People wondered what was going on. Ella held Susan close, confused and worried. The public defender leaned over to whisper something comforting, but he seemed just as confused. Time passed slowly. After a while, the door opened, and Judge Donald returned holding a brown paper bag. He walked over to Ella and Susan, his face showing more kindness than anyone had ever seen from him. "Here," he said gently, offering the bag. "I thought you might be hungry." Ella's eyes widened in surprise. With shaking hands, she took the bag. Inside were 2 sandwiches, apples, and bottles of water. Tears filled her eyes as she looked up at the judge. Susan's face brightened when she saw the food. "Can we eat it now?" she asked, looking up at her mum and then at the judge. Judge Donald smiled and nodded. "Yes, go ahead." Ella unwrapped a sandwich for Susan. The whole room watched quietly. It wasn't what anyone expected from the usually strict judge. The prosecutor fidgeted in his seat, while the public defender looked surprised but hopeful. Susan took a big bite of her sandwich, smiling as she chewed. "It's good," she said happily, her voice muffled. Ella ate slowly, glancing at the judge, unsure of what to think. She felt grateful, but also nervous about what this kindness could mean for her case. As they finished eating, Judge Donald sat back in his chair, watching them with quiet concern. The room stayed silent, except for the sound of Ella and Susan eating. Everyone waited, wondering what would happen next. When they were done, the courtroom filled with whispers. People leaned toward each other, surprised by what they had just seen. "I've never seen Judge Donald act like that," one person whispered. "Maybe he's not as tough as we thought," someone else said. The prosecutor looked uneasy, glancing between his notes and the mother and daughter. The public defender straightened up, a hopeful look on his face. Judge Donald finally spoke, calling the court back to order. The room quieted as he turned to Ella, his voice much gentler than before. "Mrs. Thomas," he said, "can you explain your actions to the court?" Ella stood slowly, gripping her hands tightly. She took a deep breath and looked at the judge. "Your Honor," she began, her voice shaking but strong. "I know what I did was wrong, but I didn't know what else to do." She paused, glancing at Susan. "My husband, he's in prison. He was wrongfully convicted years ago. It's just been me and Susan since then." Ella's eyes filled with tears, but she tried not to cry. "I've been doing my best. I have 2 jobs, but it's still not enough. The bills keep coming, and sometimes there's no money left for food." The room was silent as everyone listened to Ella. "That night, I saw the grocery store throwing out food. Food that wasn't bad, just past its sell-by date. I couldn't stand the thought of Susan going to bed hungry again, so I took it." She looked down, her voice soft. "I know it was wrong, but when your child cries from hunger, you'll do anything to make it stop." Judge Donald leaned forward. "Mrs. Thomas, why didn't you ask for help from charities or food banks?" he asked. Ella lowered her head. "I tried, Your Honor, but the food banks are too crowded. Sometimes they don't have enough food for everyone. And I felt ashamed. I didn't want anyone to know how bad things were." As Ella spoke, the room stayed quiet, her words heavy in the air. Judge Donald listened carefully, his serious face now full of thought. He leaned back in his chair, looking at Ella and Susan. Their faces showed worry and hunger. For the first time in his career, the weight of his decision felt overwhelming. The law, which had always seemed so clear to him, now felt complicated as he looked at the mother and daughter in front of him. Judge Richard Donald sat quietly, deep in thought. He had made many decisions in his career, usually without much hesitation. But this case felt different. Susan's simple words, "I'm hungry," kept replaying in his mind. Such a small statement, yet it shook him. He looked at the little girl, her eyes wide and full of both hope and fear. Then there was Ella, a mother pushed to the edge by things she couldn't control. Her story of struggle touched him in a way he had never felt before. He wondered what he would have done if he were in her place. Could he say he'd act any differently? The courtroom was quiet as everyone waited. Judge Donald had always seen himself as someone who stood for justice, firm and fair. But now he wasn't sure if true justice could happen without compassion. His eyes moved to the law books on his desk, once a source of comfort. Now they felt distant and cold. The law was clear, but was it fair in this situation? Wasn't the law supposed to help people like Ella and Susan? His hands shook slightly as he reached for his gavel. He knew that whatever he decided today would change how he saw himself as a judge. Could he follow the law while also showing mercy? Or would he have to choose between the two? Looking at Ella and Susan, he didn't just see a case. He saw two people trapped in poverty, trying their best to survive. For the first time, Judge Donald felt the full weight of his job, not just to follow the law, but to care for the people standing before him. Clearing his throat, he looked from Ella and Susan to the prosecutor. The courtroom waited for his decision. "The law is clear," the prosecutor started, his voice firm. "We recommend the standard punishment for theft, which could include jail time for Miss Thomas." Ella's face crumpled as soon as she heard the prosecutor's words. She quickly pulled Susan close, wrapping her arms around her daughter. Susan pressed her face into her mother's side, her small body shaking with silent sobs. Judge Donald felt his chest tighten. The thought of separating this mother and child hurt him deeply. Susan's simple words, "I'm hungry," rang in his mind. How could he punish a mother for trying to feed her child? He looked at his hands, resting on the bench. These hands had handed down many rulings, always by the rules of the law. But now, those same hands felt heavy, as if they had a different kind of responsibility. Judge Donald took a deep breath and made up his mind. He glanced around the courtroom, his eyes stopping on Ella and Susan. "Miss Thomas," he said gently, "the law says you should be punished for your crime." He paused as Ella hugged Susan closer. But the law also allows judges to show understanding in special cases. The room buzzed with whispers. Judge Donald was known for following the rules strictly. Even the prosecutor seemed shocked. "Considering your situation, Miss Thomas, sending you to jail would be wrong," Judge Donald said firmly. "Instead, I'm giving you 1 month of community service." Ella's eyes widened in disbelief. Susan stopped crying, a small glimmer of hope shining in her eyes. "You'll work at the community centre every weekday for a month," the judge continued. "You'll help with the food program, so others in our town don't go through what you've faced." Ella's tears of relief fell as she hugged Susan tightly. The judge felt a weight lift, knowing he made the right decision, a balance of justice and kindness. As Ella and Susan left, they walked slowly, still in shock. Ella held Susan's hand tightly, as if expecting something to go wrong. "Mama, are we really going home?" Susan asked quietly. Ella nodded, a small smile forming. "Yes, baby, we're going home." Outside, under the bright sun, Ella felt relief mixed with uncertainty. The future was unclear, but being together was all that mattered right now. Back in the courtroom, Judge Donald sat alone, deep in thought. The day's events replayed in his mind. He had always seen justice as black and white, but now it seemed full of grey. For years he had taken pride in upholding the law strictly, without letting emotions sway him. But today felt different. Susan's words, "I'm hungry," kept echoing in his head. Those simple words broke through his shield of neutrality, showing him the human side of the law. Standing by the window, he thought about other mothers like Ella, struggling in a system that overlooked their pain. Was it fair to punish someone for trying to feed their child? Was the law always right, or did justice sometimes need compassion? Judge Donald sighed heavily, knowing this case would stick with him, changing how he judged cases in the future. The road ahead wasn't clear, but he felt justice might require more understanding. As the sun set, casting shadows in his office, Judge Donald couldn't shake the image of Ella and Susan. Finally, he picked up the phone. "Mark, it's Richard Donald," he said seriously. "I need a favor." Mark, an old friend in the DA's office, listened as the judge asked him to review Ella's husband's case, the one that left her a struggling single mother. "I know this is unusual," Judge Donald admitted, "but something feels off about this whole situation." Judge Donald spent the next few days going through the files Mark sent him. The more he read, the more uneasy he felt. The evidence against Ella's husband was weak. Witness statements were unclear, and key details were missing. One night, while going through papers, he found a police report that had been left out of the trial. It mentioned another suspect who was never questioned. Judge Donald's heart raced. How had this been missed? As the facts became clearer, anger and sadness filled him. Ella's husband might be wrongfully imprisoned, and their family had suffered because of it. He thought about Ella, who had to steal to feed Susan, and about Susan growing up without her father. For the first time, Judge Donald realized justice wasn't just about following the law. It was about finding the truth. With a new sense of purpose, Judge Donald made more calls. He knew uncovering the truth would be hard, but he was determined to help Ella's family find justice. In the days that followed, Judge Donald grew more connected to Ella and Susan. One evening after work, he visited their apartment with groceries. When Ella opened the door, she was surprised. "Judge Donald?" she asked, confused. "Good evening, Miss Thomas. I brought some groceries for you and Susan." Ella hesitated but let him in. Susan, sitting at the table, smiled when she saw the food. "Hi, Judge Donald," she said, her face brightening. As Judge Donald set the bags down, Ella watched him with mixed emotions. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. "Because it's the right thing to do," he replied. "You and Susan deserve better." Over the next few weeks, Judge Donald visited often. He brought groceries, school supplies, and sometimes helped Susan with her homework. Ella slowly began to trust him, but she still wondered why a strict judge was helping them. One evening, as Judge Donald was leaving, Ella asked, "Why us? Why are you helping?" He paused, then said, "Sometimes the law isn't enough. We need to do more to make sure justice is truly served." Soon, the town began talking about Judge Donald's visits to Ella's home. Reporters even showed up, asking if his actions would affect his judgment. "No comment," Judge Donald said firmly. Inside the courthouse, his clerk Jenny handed him a newspaper with the headline, "Judge's Compassion, Justice Compromised." Judge Donald knew people were divided. Some praised him for showing compassion, while others worried he wasn't following the law. That night, as he sat alone in his office, Judge Donald thought about Susan's smile and Ella's grateful eyes. He didn't regret his decision, but he knew it had put him in a tough spot. The next day, Judge Donald uncovered something disturbing. Racial bias had influenced Ella's husband's trial. His heart sank as he realized the system had failed them. He called Sarah, an old friend who specialized in wrongful convictions. "Send me everything you found, Richard," Sarah said. "We'll fight this." Judge Donald gathered all the evidence, witness statements, court transcripts, and his notes, and sent them to Sarah. Susan's face and Ella's struggle were always on his mind, pushing him to seek justice. After sending the files, he called Sarah again. "What's next?" he asked. "We'll file a motion to reopen the case," she said. "It won't be easy, but with what you've found, we have a chance." As Judge Donald hung up, he felt a spark of hope. The road ahead would be hard, but for the first time in years, he knew he was fighting for true justice. Meanwhile, Ella sat on her couch, holding a newspaper with headlines about Judge Donald's help. She felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention. "Mama," Susan asked, her small voice breaking Ella's thoughts. "Are you okay?" Ella looked up and forced a smile for her daughter. "I'm fine, baby. Just thinking." Susan climbed onto the couch beside her mother, her big brown eyes full of worry. "Is it about the judge? Are we in trouble?" Ella's heart tightened as she pulled Susan close, breathing in her sweet scent. "No, sweetie. We're not in trouble. It's just complicated." Susan snuggled in closer. "I heard Mrs. Johnson next door. She said they might take me away from you." Ella's breath caught. She hadn't realized Susan had overheard. "Oh, baby," she whispered, voice thick with emotion. "That won't happen. I won't let it." But even as she spoke, fear crept in. What if they did try? Susan's small fingers gripped Ella's shirt tightly. "Promise?" Susan asked, scared. Ella swallowed hard, fighting back tears. "I promise, baby. We'll stay together." As they held each other, Ella's mind raced. Would Judge Donald's kindness backfire? Would the system tear them apart? "Hey, remember? We're fighters, you and me. We don't give up." Susan nodded, smiling. "Like superheroes?" Ella laughed softly. "Exactly." She felt both anxious and determined. No matter what, she'd do anything to keep her family together. Meanwhile, whispers about Judge Donald spread through the courthouse. Tensions grew, but he focused on reopening Ella's husband's case. One morning, Judge Patricia Harding visited him. "Richard," she said, her voice tense, "the Judicial Board is investigating you." Donald's stomach dropped. "Why?" "They say you're too involved. People saw you visiting the Thomas family and there are rumors you're reopening her husband's case." Donald clenched his jaw. "I'm trying to fix a wrong." "I understand, but this could cost you your career." "What happens now?" Donald asked quietly. "There will be a hearing. The board will decide if you face punishment." After Patricia left, Donald sat in silence, thinking about Ella and Susan. He had promised to uphold the law, but real justice went beyond following rules. Could he risk his career for it? Despite the investigation, Donald kept digging into the case. Late at night, he pored over files, finding more evidence of bias. Then, he discovered a witness statement that didn't match the police report. This was the break he needed. Donald hired a private investigator to track down Marita Johnson, a key witness from the case. Days later, the investigator called, saying Marita was willing to talk. When Marita sat across from Donald, her eyes showed regret. "I saw what really happened that night," she said, "but I was scared. The police pressured me." As she shared the truth, Donald felt a mix of anger and hope. Her testimony could prove Ella's husband was innocent. Despite the risks, Donald built a strong case to reopen the trial. The stack of evidence grew, bringing him closer to justice. The next day, Ella nervously knocked on Donald's office door. When she entered, she saw the judge looking tired, but he managed a smile. "Mrs. Thomas, please take a seat," he said, motioning to a chair. Ella sat down, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "Judge Donald," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to know. Why are you doing all this for us?" Judge Donald leaned back, his expression softening. "Mrs. Thomas, I believe in justice, and I believe your family has been wronged." Ella's eyes filled with tears. "But your career? People are talking. What if this makes things worse for us?" Judge Donald leaned forward. "Ella, I believe in your husband's innocence. Her breath caught. You really do? Yes, Donald nodded. I found evidence suggesting he was wrongfully convicted. I know this is scary, but I'm doing everything I can to make it right. Tears rolled down Ella's cheeks. She wanted to trust him, but had been let down too many times. How can you be sure? Donald stood and sat beside her. I found new evidence, including a witness who could change everything. Ella looked at him, searching for truth. She saw only sincerity. For the first time in years, hope sparked in her heart. I don't know what to say, she whispered. You don't have to, Judge Donald said softly. Just know I'm on your side. We'll fight this together. Later, Donald sat at his desk, staring at a letter from the district attorney's office. Request for retrial denied. Insufficient evidence. His heart sank. Just when he thought he could prove Ella's husband was innocent, this setback hit hard. Frustrated, he crumpled the letter and threw it away. Doubts crept in. Was it worth risking everything? As he considered giving up, a soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Come in, he said wearily. Ella walked in with Susan, the little girl's face lighting up. Mr. Judge, Mommy said we should thank you. Donald smiled. How are you, Susan? Her smile faded. I'm okay, but sometimes I'm still hungry. Ella squeezed her daughter's hand. We're managing, thanks to your help. Donald looked at Susan and remembered her words in court about being hungry. Her honesty had moved him. Now, seeing her, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knelt in front of Susan. Do you remember what you said in court? I said I was hungry, Susan replied. Yes, and it reminded me how important it is to help. Even when things are tough, we must keep hope alive. Susan's eyes widened. You're not going to stop helping us? Donald stood up, more determined than ever. No, Susan. I'm going to work even harder. Ella spoke softly, her voice trembling. We heard about the district attorney's decision. We understand if you can't do more. Judge Donald shook his head. This is just a setback. We'll find another way. I promise I won't give up. He started pacing, feeling the weight of his decision. His career and reputation were at risk. But when he looked at the photo of Ella and Susan on his desk, his determination grew. He picked up the phone and called a friend. Lila, it's Richard. I need your help. Lila Taylor, a journalist, listened as he explained the case. When he finished, she asked, Are you sure you want to do this? There could be consequences. Judge Donald closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his thoughts. I'm sure, Lila. It's time to shine a light on this unfairness. The next few days were busy. Lila worked hard, interviewing Ella, looking through court records, and putting together the story. Judge Donald shared all the evidence he had collected, making sure to stay within the law. As the article came together, he prepared himself for the storm that was coming. He knew that once the article was published, there would be no turning back. On the morning the story was published, Judge Donald arrived at the courthouse to find it filled with reporters. Cameras flashed and microphones were aimed at him as he walked inside. Judge Donald, have you been investigating a wrongful imprisonment case? Do you think there's racism in the justice system? Are you ready for the consequences of your actions? He pushed through the crowd, saying nothing. Inside, his colleagues looked shocked and angry. Judge Harrison, head of the Judicial Review Board, stepped forward. Richard, what have you done? This is a disaster. The integrity of the court is being questioned. Judge Donald stood firm. I did what I believe is right. Sometimes, standing up for justice means challenging the system we work for. As the day went on, the story gained attention. Social media buzzed about Ella's case and racial bias in the justice system. Calls for a review of her husband's case flooded the district attorney's office. By afternoon, Judge Donald received a summons from the Judicial Review Board. He knew this was just the start of a long fight, but thinking of Ella and Susan gave him peace. He had made his choice and was ready for the consequences. The courtroom buzzed with excitement as Judge Donald entered, determination on his face. Every seat was filled, and all eyes were on him. Ella sat nervously at the defendant's table, her hands clasped in her lap. Susan, wide-eyed and hopeful, sat just behind her. Judge Donald walked to the front, holding a thick folder. "Your Honor," he began, "I have new evidence that should lead to a full review of Mr. Thomas's case." The prosecutor, Mr. Taylor, jumped up. "Objection! Judge Donald has no right to be involved in this case." The presiding judge, Judge Carlson, raised her hand for silence. "I will listen to what Judge Donald has to say. Proceed." Judge Donald nodded and opened his folder. "I have found evidence of racial bias in Mr. Thomas's original trial, along with serious issues in the witness statements that were not properly examined." He presented document after document, revealing the unfairness of the case. The courtroom listened closely, murmurs rippling through the crowd. Mr. Taylor tried to interrupt, but Judge Carlson waved him down, focused on the evidence. When Judge Donald finished, silence filled the room. All eyes turned to Judge Carlson. She took a deep breath. "Given this new evidence, we must reopen the investigation into Mr. Thomas's case. Mr. Taylor, your office must fully cooperate with this review." A collective gasp filled the room. Ella covered her mouth, tears in her eyes. Susan squeezed her mother's shoulder, a small smile forming on her lips. Judge Carlson continued, "I'm putting Mrs. Thomas's current case on hold while we look into her husband's situation." Ella felt relief wash over her. For the first time in months, she let herself feel hope. As the courtroom began to empty, Susan tugged on her sleeve. "Mum," she whispered, eyes shining, "does this mean Dad might come home?" Ella looked down at her daughter, love filling her heart, but cautious. "It's possible, sweetie, but let's not get our hopes too high yet. We still have a long way to go." Susan nodded, but the light of hope in her eyes didn't fade. For the first time in months, she felt things might get better. Later, Judge Donald faced the Judicial Review Board, calm but determined. They quickly decided to suspend him while they investigated his connection with the Thomas family. As he left the courthouse, reporters surrounded him. "Judge Donald, do you regret what you did?" one shouted. "Yeah. What do you say to those who think you've lost your objectivity?" Another called out. Judge Donald raised his hand for quiet. "I stand by my choices. Sometimes, real justice means looking beyond the law to see the people we serve." Public opinion was mixed. Some saw him as a hero, while others thought he had hurt the court's reputation. Ella Thomas watched the news, feeling heavy-hearted. "What if we've lost our only chance?" she whispered to Susan, who sat beside her. Susan squeezed her hand. "Don't give up, Mum. Judge Donald will help us." Even though he was suspended, Judge Donald didn't give up on the Thomas family. He worked hard from home, going through case files and contacting legal experts. His dedication caught the attention of local activists who began supporting the Thomas family. They organized peaceful protests, demanding a fair review of Mr. Thomas's case and highlighting problems in the system. As public support grew, Ella found herself at the center of a movement she never expected. Neighbors she barely knew came to offer encouragement, and local businesses provided food and supplies to help her family. One evening, as Ella tucked Susan into bed, her daughter looked up with hope in her eyes. "Mum, do you think all these people can really help Dad come home?" Ella ran her fingers through Susan's hair, feeling a mix of hope and caution. "I don't know, sweetie," she said softly, "but for the first time in a long time, I feel like we have help in this fight." Days later, the courtroom was tense as Ella and Susan sat hand in hand, their eyes fixed on the judge's bench. Weeks of hard work, sleepless nights, and strong hope had led to this moment. Judge Donald, although no longer in charge, sat quietly in the back, supporting them. The new lawyer, a young woman named Cherry Chen, stood confidently before the court. "Your Honor," she began, "I have clear evidence that proves Mr. Thomas is innocent." Cherry presented DNA evidence and witness statements that had been overlooked in the first trial. Ella's heart raced as she watched, while Susan squeezed her hand tightly, a mix of hope and fear in her eyes. The prosecutor, growing uneasy, finally stood up. "Your Honor, due to this new evidence, the state wishes to dismiss all charges against Mr. Thomas." A gasp spread through the courtroom. Ella's hand flew to her mouth, tears forming in her eyes. Susan looked up at her mother, a big smile lighting her face. The judge nodded. "In light of this evidence, I order that all charges against Mr. Thomas be dropped immediately. He is to be released right away." The gavel hit the desk, but it was drowned out by Ella's joyful sobs. Susan wrapped her arms around her mother, crying and laughing at the same time. "Is Daddy coming home?" Susan asked, her voice trembling with excitement. Ella nodded, unable to speak through her tears. She hugged Susan tightly, feeling a tremendous weight lift from her shoulders. As the courtroom erupted in cheers, Judge Donald approached Ella and Susan. His eyes were misty as he gently placed his hand on Ella's shoulder. "It's finally over," he said softly. "He's coming home." Ella looked up at the man who had risked so much for her family. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. "We couldn't have done this without you." Judge Donald shook his head modestly. "You never lost hope. Your strength and love for your family made this happen." Susan tugged on Judge Donald's sleeve. "When can we see Daddy?" she asked eagerly. "Very soon, sweetheart," he replied with a warm smile. "It won't be long now." As they left the courtroom, surrounded by supporters, Ella felt a rush of thankfulness. The long nightmare was finally over. Her family would be complete again. As the courtroom began to clear, Ella and Susan made their way through the crowd toward Judge Donald, their faces streaked with tears of joy and bright smiles. Ella held Judge Donald's hand with both of hers. "Judge Donald," she said, her voice trembling, "I can't thank you enough. You brought hope to our family when everything felt dark." Judge Donald smiled gently. "Mrs. Thomas, you don't need to thank me. I just did what I believed was right." Ella shook her head, gripping his hand tighter. "No, it was more than that. You believed in us when no one else did. You saw the truth when others couldn't." Susan, who had been quietly standing next to her mother, stepped forward. In her small hands, she held a carefully wrapped gift. "Mr. Judge," she said shyly, holding it out, "I made this for you to thank you for helping my daddy come home." Judge Donald knelt down, surprised. "Susan, you didn't have to do that," he said kindly. "I wanted to," Susan insisted, placing the gift in his hands. Judge Donald carefully unwrapped the small package. Inside was a handmade card decorated with bright crayon drawings. The front showed a smiling family, Ella, Susan, and a man who must be Mr. Thomas, standing beside Judge Donald. "Oh, Susan," Judge Donald said softly, feeling his throat tighten. "This is wonderful." Susan grinned. "Open it," she said eagerly. Inside, in large handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for bringing my daddy home. You're our hero." Judge Donald felt a lump in his throat. He glanced at Ella, who was tearing up, and then back at Susan. "Thank you, Susan," he said gently. "This means more to me than you could ever imagine." As the Thomas family celebrated their reunion, word spread quickly through the town. Judge Donald's suspension was lifted due to strong public support for his actions. The town buzzed with excitement. In coffee shops and on street corners, people discussed what had happened. Many believed that Judge Donald's empathy had sparked an important conversation about fairness in their community. A few days later, on a sunny afternoon, the Thomas family visited Judge Donald's office. Ella held her husband's hand while Susan skipped ahead. When they entered, Judge Donald stood up with a warm smile. "Mr. and Mrs. Thomas, Susan," he said, "it's so good to see you all together." Mr. Thomas stepped forward, tears in his eyes. "Judge Donald," he began, his voice shaky, "I can't even begin to thank you. You saved our family when we had lost all hope." Ella nodded, holding her husband's hand tighter. "Your kindness and belief in us changed our lives." Judge Donald smiled humbly. "I only did what I believed was right. Seeing your family back together is all the thanks I need." Susan, quiet until now, suddenly spoke up. "Judge, can you help other families like ours now?" The room fell silent for a moment. Judge Donald crouched down to Susan's level, his eyes twinkling. "Yes, Susan," he replied gently. "That's exactly what I'll be doing. And it's because of brave families like yours that we can start making things better." The Thomas family looked at one another, filled with hope and gratitude. They realized their story had become more than just about them. It was now a spark for change in the community. As they stepped outside into the bright sunshine, they felt a sense of peace and purpose. Their journey had been tough, but with Judge Donald's help, they not only reunited their family, but also inspired a broader conversation about fairness and kindness in their town. In the following days, stories about Judge Donald's work on similar cases began to appear in the news. The small-town judge, once criticized for his involvement with the Thomas family, was now being celebrated as a hero of justice. The local paper, the Daily Chronicle, featured a bold headline on its front page: "Judge Donald, Defender of the Unnoticed." The article praised his hard work in proving Mr. Thomas's innocence and his ongoing efforts to review other cases where mistakes might have been made. Soon, news stations from nearby cities flocked to the town, wanting to meet the judge who had become known for his kindness in the justice system. Although Judge Donald was humble and never sought attention, he agreed to a few interviews. During one, a reporter asked him on the courthouse steps, "Judge Donald, why did you take such a personal interest in these cases?" He paused, thinking deeply. "It was a young girl's words about being hungry," he said softly. "Sometimes, it takes a child's honesty to remind us of our duty to help those who need it most." Clips from his interviews quickly spread across social media, with hashtags like Justice with Heart and Donald Way becoming popular as people discussed his approach to the law. Many who had once doubted Judge Donald's actions now found themselves admiring his courage. Nita Miller, a local shop owner who had previously spoken against the judge, admitted to her customers at her cafe, "I thought Judge Donald was making a big mistake getting involved with the Thomas case. But now I see he was right. He saw what the rest of us couldn't, and he had the bravery to do something about it." Even Judge Harold Simmons, who had been the loudest voice in calling for Donald's suspension, publicly changed his tune. At a press conference, Simmons stated, "We had concerns about Judge Donald's decisions at first, but now it's clear he showed true dedication to justice. His fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves deserves respect." Despite all the praise, Judge Donald stayed focused on his work. He spent long hours reviewing other cases, meeting with lawyers, and offering his guidance to those who wanted to challenge unfair rulings. One sunny Sunday afternoon, the Thomas family walked up to Judge Donald's simple home. Susan, holding a brightly coloured card she had made, skipped ahead. Ella and her husband followed behind, carrying dishes that filled the air with delicious smells. "Mum, Dad, do you think he'll like the card?" Susan asked, her excitement bubbling over. Ella smiled at her daughter. "He'll love it, sweetie. You made it with care, just like everything else we brought." Mr. Thomas, still getting used to life outside prison, gently squeezed his wife's hand. "I can't believe we're actually here," he said quietly. "A few months ago, I was still behind bars." Ella leaned against him, her eyes filled with emotion. And now, we're all here together, thanks to Judge Donald. They knocked on the door, and soon, Judge Donald appeared. The serious look he often wore in the courtroom was gone, replaced with a warm smile that softened his face. Judge Donald opened the door with a welcoming smile. Come in, he said, stepping aside so they could enter. I'm really happy you could join me today. Susan rushed forward, excitedly handing him a card she had made. This is for you, Judge Donald, she said, her eyes bright. The judge bent down to her level and carefully opened the card. Inside was a drawing of Susan, her parents, and Judge Donald, all holding hands under a sunny sky. Above the picture, Susan had written in shaky letters, "Thank you for bringing my daddy home." Judge Donald's eyes filled with emotion as he looked at the sweet drawing. "This is wonderful, Susan," he said softly. "Thank you. I'll always keep this." They moved to the dining room, where Ella and Mr. Thomas set down the food they had brought, a pot of hot chicken soup, fresh bread, and a sweet potato pie. "We wanted to say thank you," Ella said quietly, her voice full of gratitude, "for everything you've done for us." Judge Donald smiled warmly and shook his head. "You don't have to thank me. Seeing your family together again is the best gift I could receive." As they gathered around the table, the delicious smell of the homemade food filled the room. Judge Donald looked at the faces around him, Susan's cheerful grin, Ella's thankful gaze, and Mr. Thomas's calm expression, and felt a deep happiness that went beyond his role as a judge. They started eating, and soon the room was filled with laughter and conversation. The usually serious judge found himself at ease, talking and joking with the family he had come to care about. In that moment, all the titles and roles didn't matter. What mattered was the simple connection they shared as people. So guys, it's over to you. What do you think of this amazing story? Let us know in the comments. Until then, take care.